In fact, actually, the way that that came about was that in the 60s, when I was, in fact, before I left the field of botany, marijuana was beginning to cross the line into the middle class in this culture, especially among students and young people. And there was an astonishing absence of scientific information about it. People were giving all sorts of opinions about what marijuana did, and there was almost no human research on it. In fact, there had only been 2 times in history that people had even given marijuana to human subjects to see what it had done. And the last time had been in 1944. That was before the double-blind method was being used. So there was really almost a complete absence of scientific information about marijuana, but that didn't stop lots of people from giving expert opinions on it. This was in my senior year at Harvard Medical School. I devoted my whole senior elective time to research. I found another faculty advisor, Norman Zinberg, a psychoanalyst who was another mentor of mine who was very interested in addictions. And I proposed doing basic human study using a double-blind method to find out the most basic questions about marijuana. I mean, first of all, whether you could study it in the laboratory, how it affected basic vital functions and basic psychomotor functions. Well, this was a big thing a big bite to take. First of all, there was no legal mechanism for getting marijuana for research. There were many different federal and state agencies that were involved. A lawyer who was very interested in marijuana legal issues bet me that I would never be able to obtain permission to get marijuana to do human research. The attitude of the school was they were very upset, the Human Subjects Committee, because one of our experimental designs was that we wanted to give marijuana to people who'd never had it before, because we felt that expectation played an enormous role in determining the effects of marijuana, and people who had previously used it had expectations of what it would do. The Human Subjects Committee of the school took the position that it would be unethical to expose people to marijuana who'd never been exposed to it. We ended up doing the research at Boston University School of Medicine because Harvard wouldn't let it be done on their premises. And there was a lot of contention here. I mean, there were a lot of negotiatings with many agencies and bureaucracies. I think they were valid, but that they were surmountable. I mean, I think we had answers to them, and that, you know, the fear on the part of the Human Subjects Committee that one exposure to marijuana in a scientific experiment would lead people to become heroin addicts down the road, and then they would sue the university. And I think that was a very unrealistic fear, and that in fact there's very little research to show that people who experiment with marijuana go on to use opiates, for example. It was a very interesting time, and we did do the experiments and got away with it and got some very good publishable papers out of it. The main results were published as a lead article in Science in 1968. And I think this was the first time that it had been shown that, in fact, you could study marijuana in a laboratory and deal with the various physical, social, ethical, medical problems that came up around that. This was front page news in the New York Times, and you know, that there were also some people that were upset by our conclusions because, you know, we said that marijuana in these experiments seemed to be a relatively mild intoxicant. The effects were very heavily conditioned by people's expectations. People that had no expectation often couldn't tell whether they had smoked a placebo or smoked real marijuana. But I think that the results of those experiments have been validated over time, and the paper has actually been reprinted a number of times as a model of clinical research. You know, I've always been willing to take risks and chances, and for a lot of the work that I do, I've always been, you know, the commonest word that I've heard used is it's controversial. And now, you know, these days when it's less controversial, often I'm on talk shows and hosts will ask, you know, how do you feel about when people say you're controversial? And I say that, you know, I think if I stopped being controversial, I wouldn't be doing my job. I mean, these are just the kinds of things that I home in on. I'm interested, as I said, in what doesn't fit established conceptions, in looking at things that don't fit accepted models, and in trying to determine what's true and useful. And I think that's been sometimes difficult for people to understand, especially in the, you know, my early work. I did a lot of work in late 60s and early 70s in the field of addictions and psychoactive drugs. And one of the products of that work was a first book that I wrote called The Natural Mind, which laid out a theory that humans are born with an innate need to alter their consciousness, that need can be satisfied in many ways, drugs being just one of them, and what the psychological and social implications of that were. Well, that was indeed a very controversial book. Later I wrote a book called From Chocolate to Morphine, which was a review of all drugs that can affect the mind. And there was an organized attempt, this was in the early 1980s, to ban the book. And a prominent senator from Florida stood up on the floor of the Senate and waved the book around and said that this was a very dangerous book because it was neutral, that it didn't tell people to not use substances. And that's exactly what I aimed for. I mean, I wanted to put out neutral information, you know, and I think that when you're working in situations that are very polarized, often neither side understands the middle position. You know, that the position of neither advocating nor discouraging, of just trying to carve out a balanced path. As I moved from writing about addiction, drugs, consciousness, to writing about health and medicine, I soon realized this was no less a controversial area to operate in, and that, you know, when I first became interested in alternative medicine, especially in the early 70s, and began writing about it, I think the kind of polarization was the same as what I had seen around the drug issues. You know, you're for it or against it, and there were very few people who were trying to bring science to bear on these questions, and also to carve out a kind of middle position. And I guess I've, you know, I have a very strong sense of my own, of what's right, and I'm able to operate fairly independent of all that kind of storm that goes on. And maybe I would relate that to my upbringing, and as I said, you know, being an only child and having learned to be independent and think for myself and operate on my own. I would say more than difficult, it was lonely for a long time, because there were not other doctors out there who were advocating the kinds of things that I was doing. You know, and I was often attacked from both sides. You know, from the alternative side for being too mainstream, and from the mainstream side for, you know, being too alternative. It came from my own experience, which I've always drawn on. And, you know, when I spent all this time in South America, I learned Spanish very well. And one of the things I was delighted to discover was that in Spanish, and this is true in other Romance languages, the words for experience and experiment are the same word. In Spanish, experimentar means both to experience and to experiment. I think there's a very interesting lesson there that we miss in English, that experience is a source of experimentation, that one way to experiment is to look to your own experience. And I have never been able to understand how people trying to investigate something would rule out their own experience as one source of information about that phenomenon. Well, just for example, one of the pieces of information that I put in The Natural Mind was looking at the phenomenon of young children spinning to change their consciousness, whirling or spinning. You know, this appears at very young ages in all cultures. In every culture that I've ever been, kids spontaneously discover that by spinning, you know, they can drastically change their experience. Now, when I saw this, it resonated with my own experience. I remember doing this as a child. So I'm interested in other people doing it. And then when I begin talking to experts on child behavior and they tell me they've never seen this or there's no literature on it, I mean, that's the kind of thing that really catches my attention. I mean, this looks like something that's pretty important. You know, what is it? Where does it come from? And why isn't it studied? So that was one of the kinds of pieces of evidence that I brought into The Natural Mind, arguing for an inborn drive to change consciousness. I mean, I think we do it all the time. Oh, drugs are just one way of satisfying that need. The advantage of drugs is that they work. They provide these experiences immediately, and there's no requirement for work. The disadvantage of drugs is that when they wear off, you haven't learned anything. You They don't teach you about how to do it the next time. And if you rely on the drug as the way of changing consciousness, that is the way to getting into dependence on drugs. But I think the other point that I made in the natural mind was that the experiences that people have come from within, that they come from the nervous system, and that the drug or whatever other external thing is done is a trigger or releaser of an innate experience. In a way, I think this is a very logical flow from my earlier work with altered states of consciousness, because, as I said, the main point of the natural mind was that experiences that people have when they take mind-altering drugs come from within them, that the high comes from the nervous system, and the drug acts as a releaser. And the view that I developed about healing is very analogous to that. It's that healing comes from within. It can be elicited by treatments, but that healing actually originates within the body. That perspective, at the time that I laid it out, was not present in medicine at all. Hippocrates told us to revere the healing power of nature, for example. And I even, in that book, Health and Healing, I quoted a motto that I had come across at Harvard Medical School, probably from the previous century, that was, "We dress the wound, God heals it," which is a statement of that same thing, of the relationship between treatment and healing. But at the time that I was writing about this, I would say that view was completely missing from medicine today. There was really no interest in healing, no research on healing. The word healing was not much used in medicine. So I became very fascinated with healing and what it is and where it comes from. And my idea, which I have since developed and feel absolutely convinced of, is that healing is a natural phenomenon, something that's rooted in nature, that's inherent in the body. We are born with a healing system, with the capacity for self-repair, regeneration, and that the business of medicine is to facilitate that process. But I think the majority of patients and physicians today still think that if they get sick, that help has to come from outside. And what I've tried to do is to build up people's confidence about their own inner resources. I think that the best medicine works by, as I said, facilitating or unblocking the healing process. Look at what happens when you cut your finger. You don't have to go to a finger healer. You don't have to pray for your finger to heal. All you have to do is make sure it's clean, and it'll heal. I mean, that's all the evidence you need that the body has the capacity to repair itself. I find it easier to talk with kids about the body's healing system than I do with many of my colleagues. All you have to do with a kid is say, watch what happens when you get an owie, and you can see that the body has that capability. But here's an example of that's a little more complicated. If you have a patient with a bacterial pneumonia who's acutely ill, and you put them in the hospital and give them intravenous antibiotics, and 48 hours later they're out of danger, I think most people would interpret that as being that the antibiotic caused the cure. And what I'm asking people to do is to look at it a little differently. What the antibiotic does in that circumstance is to knock populations of germs down to a level where the immune system can take over and finish a job that it couldn't do because it was overwhelmed. And to me, that's a model for how our treatments work at their best. It's not that they work directly to produce cure. They work indirectly by impinging on innate mechanisms of healing. I think the first step that I take in assessing a patient is whether there is something there that demands immediate conventional intervention. I think the greatest sin that you can make in this field is to miss the diagnosis of a condition for which conventional medicine works very well. So that's the first thing, is to rule that out. If that's not present, then you have a lot of latitude in experimenting with other methods. But even if you use the conventional methods, I think it is often worth supporting the body in ways that can reduce the toxicity of those methods or increase their efficacy. I decided medical school by default. I never saw myself being a physician. I wanted a medical education. I had an intuitive sense that a medical degree would be useful to me. I have always been a generalist and have really resisted being put in boxes and making decisions. And people were always pressing me to say what I was going to be when I grew up, and I didn't know. And in a way, going to medical school was a way of putting off a decision for 4 years. even though that may seem like a strange way to do it. It was also on a practical level, it was during the Vietnam War, and it was a way of not dealing with that because I would continue my student deferment. I told the admissions committee at Harvard Medical School that I didn't want to be a doctor, that I wanted a medical education. And they thought that was very cool. I think they've since learned to regret it. Well, because that year, this was 1964, they took an unusually high percentage of students into this class that said that they weren't sure they wanted to be doctors, people who were non-science concentrators, and our class gave them an enormous amount of trouble. This is, I think, consistent with the times, but it was, we were a very restive group, independent group. At any rate, that was the reason that I went to medical school. I felt this was a continuation of my general education. I wanted to know about human beings. I was interested in relationship between human beings and nature and the mind and how the mind affected the body and all those things. Some students in the class dropped out one dropped out and became an actor in a theater company in New York, for example. A very high percentage went into psychiatry. We also... I was a member of a group in our second year who petitioned the dean to let us out of all classes. We said we would teach ourselves better and take any exams they wanted to give at the end of the year. It was brash, and I think we got away with it. There was a new dean who had just came in. He granted the petition, and this group of people that I was in did, in fact, we just absconded from classes, and we had great fun, and we passed all the exams at the end of the year. We found a faculty advisor, and we had available to us the notes from the lectures, but our contention was that if we would focus on learning general principles, that we would understand things better and much more efficiently than the way that we were being taught, which was to be exposed to just an enormous mass of detail. We felt we could always get the detail if we needed it, if we had a sense of the structure of a field of knowledge. I have my own ways of learning, and I never liked libraries, and I would like to get out of them quickly. So I developed very good skills at being able to go in and find exactly the information that I want and get out. And I feel very much that the way that I learn best, and I think the way that's most efficient to teach, is to teach the underlying structure of a field and let students look up the details and specifics as they need them. And that's not done in medicine today. There is a teaching of just a huge amount of detail. That was my undergraduate thesis, and this was a thesis on the use of nutmeg as a narcotic. Most people only knew it as a spice, but it has actually a history of use as an intoxicant. And at the time that I was doing this, there was a considerable use of it in prisons by people that wanted drugs and didn't have access to them. And I was just fascinated by the fact that a household spice could have a significant pharmacological effect. So certainly I tried it myself. It was not very pleasant, but I then collected a lot of accounts of other people that had used it and then researched the world's literature to see what I could find out about it. I believe I read in a book, and it might have been in Malcolm X's autobiography, describing his use of nutmeg when he was in prison. And then I began asking around, and I heard some other accounts of it. And I asked my professors and people in science, and nobody knew anything about it. And nobody thought that nutmeg was anything other than a spice. Well, it turns out to be a drug as well, and a moderately toxic one. I would say I cast a very wide net, and using all my senses, I listen and I look and I read, and when I come across things that are interesting, I follow them up, see what I can find out about them. And if I come across something that doesn't fit with accepted conceptions, it really catches my interest. It's something that I want to know about. It's been very gratifying to me to see how often that work is referred to by people working in addictions theory. I don't think it has yet very much influenced public policy, but I meet a lot of people in the neurosciences and addiction research who say that they were very influenced by that book, as well as many people who've told me that it validated their own personal experiences, that they felt that they were bizarre, unusual. They had inner experiences they never told other people about, and in reading that book, it made them for the first time realize that they had a connection on that level with other people. So I feel very, very confident about that book. It's just been reissued in a new edition. It's now 25, 26 years since it was published. I think that these ideas have really held up over time, and I still consider them very useful. I think they explain a lot of addictive behavior, and and I also feel that if we're going to try to change that kind of behavior in our culture, we have to begin by taking account of the fact that people have this great fascination with altered states of consciousness, and we have to teach them to satisfy that need in other ways. I wrote that with a collaborator, Winifred Rosen, who was an old friend and who had written children's books. And we had been approached from a number of parents who said that they didn't know how to deal with their kids who were asking questions about drugs, and the only messages they were getting out there was don't do it, and that wasn't good enough, and they wanted better information. So our intent was to write a book that presented factual, unbiased information about all categories of drugs, both legal and illegal, medical, recreational, over-the-counter, that might affect the mind, so that young people could make up their own minds as to what they wanted to do about them. Over the years, I have met many young people. I just met one a couple of weeks ago who told me that reading that book as a young teenager had been very, very useful to him, and had gotten him through a very short period of drug experimentation, and he no longer had the need to do that, whereas he saw many of his contemporaries get caught up into very long and sometimes disastrous periods of drug experimentation. I did an internship at Mount Zion Hospital in San Francisco, which was a few blocks from the Haight-Ashbury. And I did that in 1968-69, which was a very hot year politically and socially. So there were, all sorts of upheavals going on in the streets of San Francisco. So that was just an interesting time. I had made a conscious decision to do an internship at a very different kind of medical setting than I had been trained in. I had seen quite a lot of elite academic East Coast medicine, and I wanted to work at a relatively non-academic hospital in a very different social and geographical setting. So that was very useful to me. But I think the main thing that I came away from that year with was a very strong sense that I would not be using very much of that kind of medicine in my practice, and that I didn't want to take further specialization in it. I didn't know what to do in its place, but I really felt very strongly that I hadn't learned very much about how to prevent illness, and I'd always felt that the main business of doctors should be to teach people how not to get sick. And I was also became very wary of the kinds of drugs that I was taught to use. I just became very respectful of their toxicity. To drop out of medicine after 1 year of internship, there was very little professional or social support for that. I wanted to be licensed as a general practitioner. And at that time, almost everyone that I knew went on to specialty training. So that was a big decision. Secondly, I did not hear other physicians questioning the risks of the methods that they were using. And the things that I was most interested in, mind-body interactions, for example, natural medicine, the use of plants in medicine, there was nobody doing those kinds of things. And so it was a very lonely path that I proceeded on when I left professional medicine. I felt really compelled to follow my own path, and it was after I did that, that was when I wrote The Natural Mind, and then I went off to South America for about 3.5 years on a fellowship and began looking at healing practices in other cultures and testing out some of these theories that I developed, looking at them. And when I came back from that, this was now about 1973, 74, I settled in Tucson. By sheer chance, my car broke down there, and I fell in love with the desert and never left. I began writing about other kinds of medicine and thinking about it. And the University of Arizona College of Medicine found out that I was living there and asked me if I would come in, originally to give a lecture on marijuana, because the students were very interested in this and they had no one on the faculty that knew anything about it. So I gave a 1-hour lecture to first-year medical students about marijuana, which was very popular, and they then asked me if I would come back and give another lecture on addiction in general, which I did. And so I got into a pattern of every year giving these lectures. But I finally told the woman who had recruited me there that, this work on addiction and drugs was what I had done in the past, and now my current passion was really about new models of healing and alternative medicine. So I said, that's what I'd really like to talk to medical students about. And starting about must have been around 1979 or so, I began giving lectures on alternative and holistic medicine, which may have been the first lectures given in a medical school in this country on those subjects. Eventually, those lectures became the basis for the book Health and Healing that was published in 1983 or 84. And that was the first book that I wrote about health, and it remains, I'd say, the theoretical, philosophical foundation of my later thinking. The healthcare system in our country is self-destructing. One observer has said that watching what's happening to it is like watching a train wreck in slow motion. Hospitals are going bankrupt. Large academic medical centers, such as the one that I work at in the University of Arizona, are laying off faculty. Doctors are miserable in the midst of this because all the qualities of medicine that they went to it for are disappearing. As this economic crisis has descended, the response has been a corporate takeover of medicine by people whose only interest is in getting whatever profit they can out of a sinking system. The fact is that medicine has become much too expensive, and the expense is directly related to its over-reliance and over-dependence on technology. The technology is inherently expensive. There's no way around that. As long as it was business as usual in medicine, it was possible for everyone to ignore all the kinds of issues that I've raised. But now that medicine is in desperate trouble and doctors are so unhappy, they have to take notice because the market is moving in another direction. What patients want and what doctors are able to provide are becoming very divergent. And it is very clear now, I think, including to deans of medical schools, that medical schools are no longer graduating physicians who are satisfying the needs of patients. Now, what I would say patients want, based on my talking to lots and lots of patients, are that they want physicians who have the time and can take the time to sit down with them, listen to them, explain in language that they can understand the nature of their problems, and go over with them their options for treatment, who won't just push drugs and surgery as the only way of doing it, who are at least conversant with nutritional influences on health, who can answer intelligently questions about use of dietary supplements, who are sensitive to mind-body interactions, who will not laugh in your face when you bring up topics like Chinese medicine, who will look at you as not just a physical body. I think all of those are very reasonable requests, and that's not how we're training physicians today. So this is one of the reasons why so many people are seeking out other kinds of practitioners. The estimates are that between 30 and 40% of Americans are now going to alternative practitioners. And significantly, most of them are not telling their regular doctors that they're doing so. I think the reasons for that are obvious. People don't want to be laughed at, and that has been the standard response. But now that medicine is in so much economic trouble, and with this consumer demand for something else having reached some kind of critical mass, it is no longer possible for physicians to ignore all this. And as a result, in the past year especially, there has been enormous interest on the part of both institutions and individual physicians to pay attention to things that they never paid attention to before. I now direct a program called Integrative Medicine at the University of Arizona, which is the first of its kind in the world, that is actively training physicians and as well trying to develop new models of medical education that can be used in other schools. And in this past year, the University of California, San Francisco Medical Center has announced a program in integrative medicine. Duke University is doing the same. The University of Minnesota is active as well. Jefferson in Philadelphia, Stanford. So this is the beginnings of a trend, and I would predict with confidence that this is the future. And I think integrative medicine, by which I mean medicine that works from the premise that the body can heal itself if you give it a chance, that emphasizes prevention, that looks at people as more than just physical bodies, and that makes sensible use of these other modalities of treatment. I think this is really the future. I also think that if this trend succeeds, as I think it will, that one day we'll be able to drop the word integrative, and this will just be what medicine is and should always have been. All the systems of medicine that I've looked at are rich mixtures of wisdom and foolishness. And I think that's true of conventional medicine as well, by the way. And there is a rather astonishing percentage of procedures used in conventional medicine that have never been rigorously tested. So I think that what we need to do is to sort through all of this and to separate out what's useful and what's true from what's not. I don't think there's any system of medicine that has all the answers. I am a scientist. I'm very much in favor of scientific method. I'm in favor of testing and determining first what's harmful and eliminating that and warning people about that, and then trying to demonstrate the efficacy and cost efficacy of various approaches. The reason that we don't have good research in this area, I think, has a lot to do with how we're training our physicians. For example, research in mind-body medicine is not great. The reason it's not great is that the people who do medical research have come out of an educational system that has not made them realize the importance of mind-body interactions and the practical usefulness of knowing about them. So I keep coming back to the fact that unless we really begin to train a new generation of physicians, we're going to be stuck with all these problems. I think the demand for this kind of training is becoming overwhelming. And I think we are, as I say, really at the beginning of a genuine revolution and transformation of medicine. It's also, I think, important to realize that this is consumer-driven at the moment, but finally institutions are responding to it, that it's happening all over the world at different stages. It is not a fad. This is a genuine socio-cultural trend, I think, with very deep historical and intellectual roots. I think if it remains only consumer-driven, that's a problem. That is, unless there is a well thought out institutional response, I think it's a problem. Here's one example of what I mean. If you are a hospital facing bankruptcy, as many are, or if you are a managed care facility in an intensely competitive market, the economic incentives to cater to the consumer demand for alternative medicine are so overwhelming that you would be scrambling to provide services. But where are you going to get physicians to provide those services since our medical schools are not graduating them? So one of my fears is that all this is happening too fast and that a lot of programs are going to get set up, that we'll see holistic clinics and alternative medicine, this and that really aren't well thought out. And I think that would be bad for the development of the movement that I'd like to see. Based on the way that my career has gone, I would not rule out the possibility that 5 years from now I'll be doing something completely different. For the moment, it is very exciting to be involved in this wave of possibility of changing medicine and bringing it back into balance with nature, of expanding scientific horizons and paradigms to take account of observations and phenomena that have been seen as being beyond the pale. So I'll stick with that for the immediate future. I see myself working on two fronts simultaneously. One is within the profession toward professional development training, and the other is with consumers. And I feel comfortable in both of those worlds. However, I think maintaining a balance between them is delicate. And that there are a lot of physicians out there who are very popular with consumers who have no credibility with the profession. And I think I've been able to walk in both worlds, and I will continue to try to do that. And I feel both of those worlds are necessary because, as I said, it is without the consumer movement, none of this would be happening. It is consumer demand which is forcing change within the medical profession right now. And to have that go in a responsible direction is important, and I think that my voice is very much listened to as a source of information that's seen as being trustworthy, neutral. I'm not selling people things. I'm only selling information to the public, and I try to make that the best quality information that I can find. So I feel comfortable operating in both of those worlds. Just on a practical level, the 8 Weeks book was also written in response to demand of people asking me to just put all the practical information I had in one place. And a lot of this is preventive, and I think that that people who follow this kind of program, which I think is relatively easy to follow, are dramatically reducing their risks of a lot of the diseases that now consume a lot of the time and of physicians and a lot of our healthcare dollars. The kind of lifestyle information that I've put in 8 Weeks, that's my lifestyle. And again, that's consistent with all of my earlier work, that I've always drawn on my own experience. So I have experimented a lot with what works for me. I've tested that out on other people, and I've put that into the books. So I think that's a very reasonable expectation. I think all things in moderation, including moderation. And it's one of the challenges for me is that having become a public personality as a result of the books and television programs, and the fact also that I'm fairly recognizable, I have to be aware that whatever I'm doing, people are watching. If I'm in an airport eating a frozen yogurt, a lot of people are going to come over and saying, well, I guess it's all right to eat frozen yogurt.